Today, Timmy and I have the distinct pleasure of interviewing Rob Rosen, a 30-year plus journalist, television producer. He's been involved in all sorts of communications, a esteemed graduate of Boston University College of Communication, and the author of Crimes of Omission, stories about the media, essentially, and what isn't reported can be as valuable as what is reported. Our interview next. Bald,
Blind,
and Buddies.
Welcome in, everybody, to another episode of the Bald, Blind, and Buddies podcast. Today, John and I are joined by Rob Rosen, here to talk about his new book. Rob is an investigative journalist with over 30 years of experience. He's a graduate of the Boston University College of Communication. He worked on the hit series Reasonable Doubt, as well as on the infomercials that sold us with Dennis Miller. And he's here to talk about Crimes of Omission. This really fascinated me, your upcoming book. So can you tell us about that? And I'm really curious why you chose this particular omission.
Well, okay, so I've been in the business, as they say, for over 30 years, and most of it has been spent in journalism and investigative journalism. And in a strange way, even though it's a critique, and I think the material is going to be challenging for a lot of people, it's a love letter to journalism. I've worked, from CBS to running a show that took a look at wrongful murder convictions, Reasonable Doubt, that's on Max. And I have watched the business go from what I always felt was a pursuit of truth, an absolute pursuit of truth, with truth being at the North Star of our mission as journalists, to now becoming a tool of advocacy. And I call the book Crimes of Omission because despite what a lot of people will say, the media doesn't outright lie to you. Yes, the Dominion voting machines cost Fox, $780 million. Yes, that did happen. But for the most part, what you see on MS Now or ABC or the BBC is true. The bias comes from what's left out. What stories aren't covered, what elements of stories are not mentioned. And I wrote this book really like a true crime story, I hope, that tracks the anti-police movement of the 2010s, starting with Trayvon Martin through George Floyd. And I tell the entire story and allow the reader to make their own decision about whether they feel differently about the movement and about policing in the United States in the 2010s after hearing all of the information.
Now, Rod, that's interesting. I'm fascinated. This is John Boland speaking. I don't know if you know where the premise for Bald, Blind, and Buddies comes from. I'm bald, of course. Timmy's the impressive one. He is only the second person to become a medical doctor, totally blind. He's as blind as a bat. So
that is inspirational.
I know. His last name is Timmy C. Cordes. So we, who've known him for 30 plus years, call him Timmy C. Nothing. So he can take a good joke. He can give as well as he gets. But he's the one that you're going to really want to talk to.
That's a microaggression now, John.
That's fine. I'm into microaggressions.
Well, so is bald, isn't it?
No.
Isn't bald considered a microaggression?
Statement. No, that's a factual statement.
Okay. I thought I saw that.
Yeah.
And now this is a real thing. If you Google it, I think they say that if you call someone bald in the workplace, it is now considered a microaggression.
Do they have a high reflectivity cranium or something, or what? What are we supposed to?
I don't have a 4-head. I have a 5-head.
Yeah.
So anyhow, the reason
follically challenged.
Follically challenged.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's okay. And I was this way from basically when Timmy and I met. I started losing my hair in my freshman year. So it's been 30 plus years I'm longer without than with. To that end, though, I'm fascinated that you make the contention, and I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying if maybe you can substantiate it, that the real crime is omission and not what is stress. Because one of the things that I've done, I'm a classic small L liberal. I like to say I'm a liberal who's asleep, meaning I'm not woke. I believe I signed up for liberalism for, my daughters to have equal rights and equal representation. It doesn't mean that in Los Angeles you should be able, or in San Francisco you should be able to just defecate in the streets. That's where I think liberalism has gone off the ranks. What I'm asking, though, is you're saying, and I agree with you, that omission's the biggest problem. That being said, however, isn't it also the stress points? Meaning Fox News is going to stress certain things. MS Now is going to stress certain things. So do you see a corollary between the two, or is it really omission as you see it as the big crime?
I think we're saying the same thing, to be honest with you. I mean, if you are omitting some facts, you are stressing others. Let me give you an example, and this is kind of a good, I think, somewhat nonpartisan way to look at it. So, a month ago, if you guys remember the story in, I think it was West Bloomfield, Michigan, a man strapped a bunch of explosives into a car and drove into a temple where there were 150 preschool Jewish students there, and he was presumably attempting to commit a mass murder. Security guards stopped him. There was a shootout. He was killed on the site. Now, NPR did a story, and in that story, they didn't interview anybody from the temple. They didn't interview any of the parents of the kids who had this close call. They didn't talk to anybody, the wife of the security guard. Instead, they went to the perpetrator his home country. He was a Lebanese American, and it turns out that his brother was a high-ranking Hezbollah person who had been taken out in an airstrike. And the story was highly sympathetic. I'm assuming I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt. All the quotes were correct, and local people described this guy who had strapped explosives and driven into the temple as very kind and very gentle. They said that he was very upset by the airstrike that took out his brother and that this was some form of vengeance. Now, this to me, you can either say that it was a case of stressing a certain set of facts or crimes of omission. But to me, the bias in this was very clear. I don't think that ABC News in the 90s would have sent a reporter to upstate New York to get glowing bites about Timothy McVeigh, and which is where he was from, and trying to understand what the moral justification for his crime might have been. So, this was an example to me of bias, but they can hide behind the shield of, well, everything we said was the truth.
Well, it's a fact of human cognition, right? In order to pay attention to something, you're by definition not paying attention to something else, right? So that their focus actually is directly tied to the omission.
Right.
Makes
And
sense?
so, yeah, no, it 100% makes sense. And I think that is, I'll give you just a completely different type of example, but during the COVID restrictions in California, where we had some of the strictest rules, the press here is very much in the pocket of the ruling democratic power structure of the state. So I'm not saying that the press should have taken any sort of a position on this, but they should have asked tough questions. Why are our schools closed for a second year while Europe's been open for a long time? Why was Walmart and Target allowed to stay open the whole time, but mom and pop stores had to be closed down? I mean, there were a lot of questions that could have been and should have been asked because holding truth to power is one of the key jobs of the fourth estate. And they didn't do it. They fell down on the job.
Yeah, I noticed that. I mean, in COVID, right, rallying in the streets and shouting and things was somehow not a super spreader event, but going to church was, and like I thought that was always an interesting juxtaposition because both of those happened at the same time.
Timmy, to ever justify religiosity, but on this one, I have to agree with you. Why is it okay that Walmart was open, or for that matter, the casinos in Las Vegas, while people were unable to worship as they saw fit during that time? And I think the COVID pandemic, for me, Rob, to be perfectly candid, was sort of a seismic moment because I'm not saying that my trust in government was infallible. I'm saying, given a choice between 0 to 100, I was 60% I would believe, and 40% I would be skeptical. Now I would say the inverse, if not even more so, is true, because we were basically, I mean, even the noble lie is still a lie, and that's what Anthony Fauci did. So,
and wouldn't it have been a different outcome if the press, instead of just completely going along lock, stock, and barrel with the official government and agency positions, asked tough questions, which is their job? I mean, I'm not suggesting that the press should be advocating for an anti-lockdown position, but they should be skeptical and they should be asking tough questions, and they shouldn't have marginalized, the Great Barrington Declaration, which you guys probably know about, which was, I mean, hundreds of top epidemiologists from Oxford and Harvard had signed this declaration, saying that these lockdowns were madness, that there should be targeted lockdowns or more of a Swedish model. I asked a former news director of mine who was really well regarded about this. and he didn't know what the Great Barrington Declaration was because his sources of news didn't report it.
But could not the same, and I'm not trying to create, and Timmy knows this, I hate false equivalency, but could not the same be applied to September 12th, 2001? Meaning anything that the government fed us, we were attacking somebody, right? That's where I just become frustrated because I see it on both sides, liberal and conservative. There's a failing. And I think your point is very well received to that end. And I'm giving you adulation for this, which is it's really the purpose of journalism has lost its central focus. Is that not a fair summation?
I think so. And I mean, you make a good point with 9/12, but I still think I was very active in journalism still at that period of time. And I would say that the overall look, there's always been a bit of a left or blue bubble kind of bias to news because unlike the first generation of TV news people in the 60s and 70s, who were mostly working class people who didn't have college degrees, Walter Cronkite didn't have a college degree. It became sort of an elitist profession, and you really had to come from one of the better journalism schools. So the disconnect between the audience, the news audience, and the people who were bringing them news just was becoming wider. And I think when you get to the 90s and early 2000s, yeah, if you went into a typical newsroom, it was going to be 6, 7 to 1 liberal, but everybody still felt as though the mission was the truth. I mean, look at the Monica Lewinsky scandal and the vociferous appetite that the news media had for covering that story and really exposing it. Now contrasted, and I'm not saying it's an equivalence. I don't want to make a false equivalence, but now contrasted with Tara Reid, not the actress, the woman who had some fairly credible claims of sexual harassment against then candidate Joe Biden, and it just wasn't covered at all, right? So I'm not making any kind of judgment on whether her claims were accurate or not, but they were stronger if you looked at them carefully than the claims that were made against Brett Kavanaugh. But those claims got a ton of coverage and were treated as very credible, and the Biden ones were just buried.
Curious, dovetailing on that point, how do you feel about the Jeffrey Epstein coverage? Because it seems to me that it's ebbs and flows, and I'm not trying to, salaciousness sells. Timmy and I last week talked about Mike Vrabel and the insatiable appetite. Sex sells. If it bleeds, it leads. I get that. But how do you feel what kind of grade would you give as a professor to, the news media for their coverage of the Epstein, what are legitimately credible claims against very, very powerful and connected people?
I mean, I think that the coverage has ebbed and flowed, and I hate to make it sound like it's so partisan, but the media has become very partisan, right? So I think Fox News was far more interested in the story when Joe Biden was the president,
Yeah.
and when right, and when President Trump was running again and promising to just be completely transparent and release all the files. They were very interested in that story then, and then they lost interest. And I think vice versa for some of the more left-leaning outlets. So, my call for all this is that if truth is your North Star, if that is really your mission, you have to be outcome independent. It's sort of like Zen in the art of journalism. You have to be outcome independent. So if you and I never pronounced his name right, but Bakwat, I believe was his name, the editor of the New York Times in 2015, he made a really critical mistake for the profession where he said to his staff, look, the rules don't apply. Donald Trump is a uniquely dangerous threat to our democracy, and we've got to go after him, and the coverage does not need to be balanced. This gave the permission structure for the rest of journalism because the New York Times still leads in many ways. It gave them the permission structure to now go after him in a way that they never would have gone after a different kind of a candidate. And in the book, I have a lot of inside information about what was going on at CNN, how Jeff Zucker, in a lot of ways, helped build him in the beginning of his election because it was a novelty and it was great TV, and then how hard the network turned against him once they realized they had created this monster. So I think that anytime
you're referring to Trump in that instance, just making
yes, I'm sorry. Yeah,
that's okay.
Yeah, thank you.
I just want to make sure.
No, thank you for thank you for clarifying that. But I think that look, anytime you want an outcome, anytime that the media is saying such and such a candidate is a threat to the environment, a threat to democracy, you have now lost objectivity. You've moved from being a truth teller to holding a mirror up to reality, which is what Walter Cronkite said our jobs were, to now being an advocate who's looking for an outcome. And that is a trap that I think modern media has fallen into. And I think that I hope this doesn't sound too high minded, but until they can climb out of that, until we can have a shared reality, then there's really no hope to end this polarization. Because, look, I have relatives who are very far left, and then I have other relatives who are very conservative. And when they talk to each other, if we're at Thanksgiving, they are not describing the same world. They have
Will you invite me to your
completely
Thanksgiving
different
dinner
views of
this
reality.
year, Rob? Will you invite me?
If you
Just for like Jeff Zucker, just for the entertainment value of Donald Trump, I would like to just sit in the room and just watch this, because I experienced the same phenomenon myself.
Yeah, it's quite a thing. I guess, as a psychiatrist, I always am fascinated with why people do what they do, right? And so in behavioral therapy, we have this idea that people don't do something either because they can't or they don't want to, right? And so if we say, well, why aren't they reporting neutrally? Is it because they want an outcome? They have not learned how to think critically? What in their education, like they don't know what a journalist is supposed to be? Could you speculate why you think this exists this way?
why the journalists themselves and journalism itself has turned this far into advocacy?
Yeah, yeah. And omission.
Okay, I know. I just
Sorry.
wanted to. Yes, I think that it was a sort of the 50-yard line just slowly kept moving. I think that the initial wave, and I get into this in the book a little bit, that first wave of TV news reporters in the 60s and 70s, and I spoke to some of those legendary old timers who were telling me about those days. It was a bias that was probably really too far to the right. They all had really good sources in the police departments. These were mostly white men. Most of them did not finish high school or college, and they were tough. They were good about calling truth to power, but they really had a very narrow view of what the world was, because it was the same type of person that was in those newsrooms. I talked to a guy who's a legendary USC professor of journalism, Joe Saltzman, and he was saying he was at the CBS news desk during the Watts riots, and he said literally everybody in there was just kind of stunned. They didn't like where was this anger coming from? It caught them by surprise because it wasn't part of their world. There was no diversity in that newsroom. So slowly, I think news correctly started diversifying, bringing in a lot of women, people of color, people from different neighborhoods. But what has slowly happened, and I think it really accelerated in the last 20 years in sort of a doom loop, is that while you had a diversification of immutable traits, you started having a monoculture where almost everybody, if you walk into a CNN newsroom or MS Now or ABC, almost everybody is from a middle class to upper middle class background or a wealthy background. They went to good schools. They live in blue cities. They, go to the co-op and they have Pilates classes and they have, they have gluten allergies that they're indulging. Yes. Erewhon if Whole Foods isn't expensive enough. And so you have a newsroom that is filled with people who see the world the same way and experience it the same way. Is there somebody there who grew up on a farm and was part of a very fundamentalist religious movement? Likely not. Is there someone who is very conservative and, maybe, belong to the college Republicans club? Not likely. I believe the latest polls show that it's something like 15-1 self-identified liberal over conservative in America's newsrooms. And I think where that plays out, guys, is, and this is where a lot of the crimes of omission start from, is you every day in a newsroom, whether it's local news or the national news, there's a morning meeting. And everybody gathers together and the bosses are there and people pitch stories for the day. Now, there's always an unspoken culture in an organization. Are you going to be the person at Fox News who in the morning holds up your hand and says, there's a new UN report about how climate change is disproportionately adversely impacting people of color? You're not going to do that, right? And if you do, you're quickly going to be labeled as the guy who doesn't get it.
That's me.
Right. And if you're over and if you're at MS Now, are you going to be the one to raise your hand and say, I hate to say it, but in Trump's second term here, the jobs report came in this morning, and it's pretty robust, and it seems to be real wages are raising. I think we should cover that too. Well, they're not going to cover that. So I think that these organizations create their own dogma, and nothing has to be written down. Nothing's got to be put into a memo. There's no smoking gun, but people know what's expected to them, and people know what kind of stories and how to cover stories in a way that will get them noticed and promoted.
Hey, Rob, I have a 3-part question if you'll indulge me. Number one is,
of course,
there are unwritten rules in life, right? And the one that I always use to explain to people unwritten rules is the urinal one for men. You go into a bathroom in the airport, and there's a urinal on the end, and there's 3 open you go to the furthest one away, right? It's just unspoken truth. People do not want to stand next to somebody while they're at a urinal, as a simple truth. I mean, that's kind of how people learn these unwritten rules. Secondarily, and I mean this in jest, do you think by calling us guys, you committed a microaggression? And number 3
yes,
is,
I did.
Yes, you did, yes. And you called me a bald guy. I mean, that's a double whammy.
Oh, yeah.
I am having fun, please.
My God.
We don't take each other seriously.
No.
But my real question to you is Fox News, was the creation of Fox News in 1996 a reaction? Was it part of the problem? Is it part of the problem? Is it part of the cure? What percentage of blame? Because the way in which I see it, and I'm not saying anything you've said so far is incorrect or that I don't see exactly what you're saying. What I'm wondering, though, is if the newsrooms were so far left, was Fox News a necessary reaction to that? And is the creation of MS Now, the pendulum swinging back the other way? What percentage of blame? What is Fox News? Is it the cure? Is it the solution? Is it the problem? Just broadly speaking.
All of the above. So when it started in 1996, look, when it started in 1996, it's not the Fox News that we know today. And the media was not as activist as it is today. I believe that activism, if I had to give a flashpoint, I would say it was probably the contested 2000 election, followed by the Iraq War and the fallout from that, and then the election of Barack Obama. So by the time you get to 2012 and Trayvon Martin, and I don't know, which came first, the chicken or the egg, but that's where my book starts. I think by 2012, newsrooms have been infiltrated with young social justice warriors who are questioning the fundamental precepts of journalism and challenging them within the newsroom, and they're winning those arguments. And so back to your question about Fox News, because I did the politician thing of answering the question I wanted to answer, not the one you asked. In 1996, I think you had a sort of elitist, left of center bias in news, but it was subtle. It really was subtle. And Fox News was a little bit subtle too. As an example, in the year 2000, 1 week before the election, it was found out that George Bush had had a DUI in 1976. That story was not broken by the major news networks. It was broken by Fox News. And a lot of evangelicals stayed home, and it's believed by many that had Fox News not broken that story, the election wouldn't have been as contested. Bush would have won by a much more comfortable margin, and we wouldn't have had 36 days of crisis. So I think that the early days of Fox News were very different than what it ultimately became. I would say that at this point, Fox News and MS Now have found their audiences. I don't think that if you watch it, because I watch both of them, I watch everything. If you watch them, you're not getting disinformation. You're just only getting a little piece of the jigsaw puzzle. So unfortunately, and I hate to be the messenger of bad news or the carrier of bad news, but if people want to be very well informed, they have to watch a lot of sources of news and read a lot, because it's almost like, to use the jigsaw puzzle analogy, it's almost like every network holds one piece of the puzzle, but they won't give you more than that. And so if you want to put the whole picture together, you need to watch all of them and take one piece here and one piece there.
I don't know if it's a good strategy, but I find myself gravitating to some of the publications from the UK, etc. You know, like I know where the Guardian leans, but then when it covers the US, at least it doesn't have the internal US bias. I don't know if that's a useful strategy or not.
I mean, I think reading every look. I think that some of the networks that do the best job right now is look with Barry Weiss coming into CBS
Mm-hmm.
News. I think she's really trying to bring it back to a centrist, objective, both sides of the story, hard news organization that you can trust. But a lot of people are hysterical about that here, and I think when you've been fed decades of confirmation bias, the truth can seem like advocacy. But that's not what's. I don't think that's what she's trying to do at CBS. I'm a big fan of her work. CNN is reforming itself a little bit, but still tons of crimes of omission. And I think Fox and MS Now are never going to be incentivized to do anything but tell the parts of the stories and cover the kinds of stories that their audience wants. And they're doing well with it. My issue is with the other news organizations. You had all these layoffs at the Washington Post recently. Uh, ABC, NBC, and CBS nightly news is just a shadow of its former selves as far as impact and viewership. Why these organizations don't try to get back to objective hard news is beyond me, because they're holding on to a shrinking pie, and what they're doing is not working.
Does objectivity sell, Rob? And what I mean by that is,
I believe it does.
okay, because going back to my
I
earlier
believe it
point
does.
about
And I'll
plays
tell you what.
against, yeah.
Yeah, but it can still bleed. But maybe there are two reasons. Look, let's just take this West Bloomfield, Michigan example I gave you. Okay, you have the one NPR story that clearly has an agenda. It's an obvious agenda, right? Where they're trying to make this. They're trying to turn this tragedy and the story of someone who's unbalanced into a story that is anti-Israel, right? I mean, that's the agenda behind it. We all know what it is. Okay. But what if you just covered the story in a more human way? What if you talk to the parents? What if you talk to the rabbi? What if you talk to a Holocaust survivor who, is scared because they feel like things that they saw in Germany are starting to happen again right here in the United States? And then what if you also talk to people from the Arab American community and how they feel, and if they feel they're being, isn't that a more interesting story and a more relevant story, and a story that would touch you in the gut more, and would tell all sides of a story, but in an intelligent way and in a relevant way, as opposed to just trying to use this tragedy to score cheap points on a unrelated issue?
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm also thinking about the motivation for why people do this. I'm wondering if journalist as a celebrity is another motivator, right? Woodward and Bernstein became household names, and then people can go into journalism to say that I'm going to make a name for myself by doing X. Like, do you think that is a motivator for going along with the groupthink and etc.?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that Charlie Munger would always say, "Show me the incentives, and I'll show you the outcome."
Hmm.
And I think that as long as the people who run these news organizations are looking the other way as journalists post on X their very highly subjective opinions about certain issues, which would have been forbidden just 15 or 20 years ago, as long as they're okay with airing stories that clearly are not giving both sides of an issue and are really more like pieces of activism than pieces of true objective journalism, as long as those things are incentivized, then yeah, I think this continues. I mean, it changes when the people who run these organizations decide it's going to change. And I do want to just to go back one question. You said, does objective journalism sell? This is my analogy. Confirmation bias journalism, activist journalism, if this was a Hollywood movie, would be like a Marvel movie. Okay, it sells. You know exactly who the goodies are. You know who the baddies are. You know from the beginning how the story is going to end. It's very predictable, but to some audiences, it's very satisfying. I
That's how I
get
described the Democratic National Convention last year.
it. but to me, a good objective newscast is like a great legal drama. You think one side's correct for a minute, and then, oh, wait, here's this other piece of information. It's changing my mind, and it goes back and it's forth, and there's conflict because you're getting both sides of a story. To me, it's a much more compelling and enriching experience. And by the end of it, I feel like I can make up my mind.
Hey, Rob,
I don't think
have
that I feel that way.
I was just going to say bravo for using that legal analogy, because I used to teach constitutional law. And one of my favorite cases to lecture on was a case, arcane case, but major because it touched on all the social hot button issues, called Bowers versus Hardwick. It was whether or not the state of Georgia could criminalize homosexual sodomy. And it touched on all these sorts of major issues. And if you read the opinion of the court, it was 5-4 at the time, and it's since been overruled, and I think rightfully so. But you could legitimately see how Georgia won the case. And this is somebody who believes that homosexuals, myself, have every right, that this is part of the reason I signed up for liberalism. So to your point, bravo about using that analogy. But a 10,000-foot question, and that's my last question for you. You just said that Charlie Munger used to say, show me the incentives and I'll show you the motivation, right? Do you think that
I'll show you the outcome.
Yeah.
I'll show you the outcome.
Do you think that journalism should be a for-profit industry? And there's a handful of industries that I have a problem with them being for-profit as an overarching principle. Believe me, I understand the profit motive. I'm a capitalist. I get it. But do you think that incentivizes sort of sensationalism as opposed to objectivity?
I'm going to push back on your premise 100%. I believe that it should be free enterprise, and I'll tell you exactly why it shouldn't be. Why it shouldn't be publicized. NPR is, national public television. There is no source of more disinformation and more bias than public broadcasting. In fact, the CEO, and her name escapes me at the moment, of public broadcasting, gave a speech maybe 6 years ago where she says we really have to let go of these ideas about objectivity because they're old-fashioned and they really just uphold the current white power structure. This is the woman who's running public broadcasting, and she's kept her job and she's still there. So no, I don't want government. I don't want the Trump administration deciding what is truth and what is information. I don't want the next administration, it could be a Democratic administration, deciding what truth is, because absolute power corrupts absolutely. And, just check the North Korean news sources to see, how Kim Jong-il had 18 hole-in-ones today, to see what happens when you allow government. Yeah, when you allow. Yeah, so no, I think that, look, sensational is not necessarily the enemy. It's okay to have clickbait. It's okay to want eyeballs. The enemy is withholding huge swaths of stories and only allowing the American public to have a tiny myopic view of the world, so that they themselves end up being misinformed, distrust their neighbors because we're not sharing a reality anymore. I think that's the bigger issue. I'm much less concerned about sensationalism. What's sensationalism except just saying that you're getting people excited to read a story? I mean, I think that's okay.
Did you know that when The Onion named, jokingly, Kim Jong-il the sexiest man alive, the North Korean press didn't realize it was a spoof newspaper?
Oh, I remember that.
Yeah.
Yes, isn't that amazing? That's so funny.
Yeah. So
I did see that. That's great.
Yeah, as my question, I guess, give us some writing a love letter to the media. What's the reconciliation? What's the hope?
Here's the hope, and it ties into the last question. The hope is that it's ultimately a for-profit industry. It's not working for anyone outside of Fox News and MS Now. This system is failing. This model is failing. And I believe that ultimately capitalism will self-correct. The consumer is the king. And I think that the consumers of news are making it clear that they no longer trust their sources of news, and we're in the trust business, and that they want something different. So I take hope with something like News Nation, which I don't know if you're familiar with it. I think Chris Cuomo and Ashley Banfield, who I talked to in the book, they're trying to do objective newscasts, and they're having some success. It's starting to work for them. And CNN is trying to slowly clean things up and be a little bit more objective and less of a biased news source. So ultimately, I think that enough people will demand change that my hope is that it's going to start to happen. There are a lot of very entrenched, it's a big battleship. So if you go to like a CBS, it's a lot of people who have who are part of unions, who've been there for decades. They're very hard to move, and so it's going to take time. It took a long time for us to get here, to break this, and it's going to take a long time to fix it. But if I can end on a lofty sentiment, and I hope this doesn't sound too sanctimonious, but ultimately I don't think the country heals itself until the media repairs itself, because we can't continue to live in different realities and expect people to come together. If you think the number one threat to this country is political correctness, creeping socialism, and an open border, you have nothing to talk about with someone who believes that capitalism is destroying the planet and that white supremacy is the biggest problem facing America. And there are elements of truth to all of these things. But if that's your worldview, the two of you will have nothing to discuss.
Rob, I have to sign off. I'm going to let Timmy take it from here. But
very nice to meet you.
Pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Well. Great. Would you say the free press is an example of finding the money in that kind of journalism?
Yeah, I think, the free press isn't I subscribe to it, and I have from the beginning, but it's, it's not a comprehensive news source.
Right.
You can't use that as your only source of news. But I think that they've done a really good job of looking into third rail issues that traditional media is too scared to touch.
Yeah.
And so it's very provocative and interesting. I would challenge anyone who doesn't know the free press, like, I don't know, get a trial or something, and read some of the articles there and compare it to what you're getting in your local newspaper. It's going to be a lot more interesting. And it's so institutional now. Like, I read the LA Times because I try to read as much as possible. And it's just such an institutional paper, right? It's almost like it's a vessel of the state.
Right.
It veers on propaganda at times.
I remember that there was this, I don't know if it was a meme going around in the early 90s, and it was how newspapers would announce the end of the world. I don't know if you ever saw this. And it would be like, USA Today is like, it's over, and the New York Times is world ends tomorrow, women and children hurt worst, right? And it's just, you see these biases. It's pretty fascinating.
Do you remember the very famous Norm Macdonald tweet?
No.
It's probably the most famous tweet. Okay, so it's a little bit politically incorrect. I want to forewarn your audience, trigger warning. But he wrote a tweet, the late great comedian, where he said, if ISIS tomorrow dropped a nuclear bomb that killed 50 million Americans, my biggest fear is that there would be an increase in Islamophobia.
Yeah.
There's something.
Yeah, there is something.
There's something to that.
Yeah. And speaking of comedians, Dennis Miller, how is, I always find him insightful, and anybody who can quote Sartre, in the midst of a joke, has my lesson. How was working with him on projects?
I absolutely loved working with him. I did the infomercials that sold us. It was a 3-part limited series, and we ended up working together. I was intimidated at first because, of course, it's the great Dennis Miller, and he's so smart, but the sweetest guy and funny. Like, he would just out of nowhere, like, sometimes just text me or call and just say, hey, I just want you to know, I'm really proud of this project. I mean, it's not Battleship Temenkin, but it's pretty good. Potemkin. I ruined my own joke, or his joke. But anyway, yeah, he was super smart, whip smart, and just so encouraging.
Because I have this notion, and I think maybe both of those guys hit on it, is that humor lets us say to ourselves, there's another way to look at things. And so I think that's why sometimes these comedians now is the only place you can push back sometimes. And even some of them are trying to reel it in. So I'm curious your thought of why comedians can do this, perhaps.
Well, I think that comedy in a lot of ways mirrors the issues that we've had with journalism, right? So I think there are a lot of people who, I think he was named the most trusted man in TV, Bill Maher, right? So Bill Maher is someone who's openly left of center, but he also calls out the BS on his side all the time. You never really know what he's going to say. He likes to have conversations with conservatives and people on both sides of the aisle. And he suddenly has become sort of, in the comedy world, what I'm saying journalism should be.
Yeah.
And then you've got people like Stephen Colbert or Jimmy Kimmel who are just clearly making jokes for one side of the aisle. And if you are a centrist or right of center, there's really no place for you on those shows anymore. And that they've kind of followed the model of the MS Nows or the Fox Newses, in reverse. And so, yeah, I think that there was a really stifling period. I would say probably from the late 2010s up until maybe 2021, 2022, where comedians were suddenly under pressure to conform to woke ideology. I mean, you remember Dave
Dave
Chappelle getting
Chappelle.
attacked on stage.
Yep.
Yeah, he refused. But I think that there were some courageous comedians who led Bill Burr, Dave Chappelle, Bill Maher. They were not going to silence themselves. They were not going to allow social justice advocates um, to stop them from the free expression of humor. Um, and the funny thing about it is, as far as I know, I think all three of the ones that I just mentioned, Chappelle, Burr, and Maher, are liberal.
Yeah.
And yet
and
the
successful.
left was going after them. Yes.
Yeah, in the
But
market.
the left was going after them the left was going after them with pitchforks. Like they wanted to censor. I did a podcast at the time called Canceled, and it was about cancel culture. And I said it was the one show you never wanted to be booked on. But when somebody had been canceled, they would come and do a last stop with me. I had a co-host, and we would interview them. And it was really a chilling time in America. I didn't live through, I'm not old enough to have lived through McCarthyism, but it felt like that. But this time, the censors were from the left.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, we really want to thank you for your time. Is there anything last thoughts you want to part with?
Can I do the shameless book pitch?
Absolutely.
Okay, no shame. Crimes of Omission. Pre-sales are happening now by Rob Rosen. You can pre-order. The book comes out on June 2nd. And it really reads like a true crime story, but it cuts back and forth between these cases that made worldwide headlines, from Trayvon Martin to George Floyd, and tells the complete story about them. And it also takes you into America's biggest newsrooms with interviews with some of the biggest names who are telling us what went on. How did these disastrous decisions get made during that period?
Cool. Yeah, I'm gonna check it out as soon as I get it off, get it in audiobook format or something. But yeah, awesome. We're so glad to have you on. We are so grateful that Rob could make the time to join us. I really learned a lot from the discussion.
He was chock full of information, wasn't he?
Yeah.
And he seemed to just sort of do it extemporaneously, almost like it was rote. Do you know what I mean? ROTE. Right. That he just kind of pulled his experiences and was able to just delineate them in such a clean and clear fashion. I was impressed.
Yeah, no, I think so too. And there's that line from Shawshank, and it's like, when I think about the modern press, it's, how can you be so obtuse? Is it deliberate, right?
Right. You know what happens after he says that, right? He sends him to solitary for a month, and then another month after that. So
yeah. But I think he started to help us think about those questions, because it's important. We all occupy. I believe we all occupy the same universe, and there are some facts which I think we can agree on. We may not agree on solutions, but we can compromise, right? And that's sort of what this podcast is about.
Yeah, and the thing that really resonated with me, I don't know, it's something that struck me, was when he was talking about there has to be a shared truth, and then he talked about people in the South, white supremacy versus this versus that. That really sort of, because if you're not able, and he talked about his Thanksgiving dinner with his family, and Timmy, I can relate to that. Where it's literally people are now sitting at different ends of the table and don't interact because of, God forbid, their politics, and it's just terrible. But there has to be a shared truth. But I have a question for you in light of all this, because if I had to rank it in terms of my optimism versus pessimism after hearing Rob speak, I would say it's now 65-35, positive versus negative. Prior to that, I would say it was more like 60-40. So he's definitely moved me in the more positive direction, because he talked about how the market is self-correcting, and ultimately, he has faith that there will be an acceptance of shared truth, and the consumer has primacy and will ultimately determine it, right? Mm-hmm. But then I also remind myself, and why I still remain somewhat pessimistic, is there's so much money to be made in division that's where I worry that a lot of these organizations, and I did ask him, I said, do you think objectivity sells? And he did really, take that head on. I was impressed. I just worry that maybe it's just so much money to be made by dividing that it's not going to be as easy as we think.
Yeah. However, though, I think you and I have seen that you can only go so far with silos, right? At some point, things aren't gonna connect even within a silo. You're gonna say, wait a second, there's a bigger picture than this. And I think a lot of people have that moment. For me, one of them was COVID, and it's like, I need to look beyond. And I think, a lot of people have gotten to that place or can get to that place where they're actually looking for news and not just, feeding their wishes.
Final thought I had, he had talked about how he is a voracious reader of information and tries to get it from all sources. And I try to do the same. I subscribe to the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and I figure the Economist as well. Mm-hmm. Somewhere in there is probably, if you were going to, make jambalaya or stew is an element of truth, so to speak, as he talked about the pieces of the puzzle. Mm-hmm. I just wonder what he would think if I told him that I had to take a step back and stopped consuming any news. Do you know what I mean? Because it's one of those things that I found it's probably better for my mental health. Yeah. So I'm just curious what his viewpoint. I didn't get a chance to ask him, but I'm curious what his viewpoint would be on that. What do you think?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, Timmy C, as always, it was great to chat with you, and we have some upcoming guests. We'll let the folks know as soon as they're officially booked. But any big plans? By the way, let me just extend a heartfelt Happy Mother's Day to all the mothers out there. I'm reminded of something somebody told me 40 plus years ago, and they said when God realized he couldn't be everywhere at once, that's when he decided to make mothers. And Happy Mother's Day to all the mothers that are listening.
Happy Mother's Day, ladies.
And Timmy, I'll sign off as I normally do. This is John Boland saying, hey, misbehave, drive fast, take chances.
And this is Tim saying, if everybody likes what you're doing, you're probably not doing anything worthwhile. Let's take care out there and keep talking.